Good morning. It's a great privilege to be here to be able to study God's Word and present some of the ideas that I've learned. I'm going to do a brief history of the time period and then go into a quick recap of chapters 3 and 4 and then get into a few ideas about chapter 5. In Ezra 1, in the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, Cyrus was to build God a house in Jerusalem. He allowed the Jews to return to Jerusalem to build the temple, and anyone who stayed could provide gold and silver and goods to help. So Zerubbabel led Israel back and began the building of the temple. And after a long struggle, the temple was finally built. Then, about 80 years later, Ezra returned, and Ezra was a scribe in the law of Moses, and prepared his heart to seek the law of the Lord, and to do it, and to teach in Israel statutes and judgments. When he came back, he found in Israel the people that were joined with the inhabitants, were not separated, and were committing abominations, and were intermarried with non-Jews. He got them to repent, change, and follow God. And after about 13 years later, Nehemiah returned to build the wall. And again, we see the falling away from God of the Jews, and that the wall was not built, and the city was in disrepair. There were many problems that faced Nehemiah in rebuilding the wall. In our last gathering, we discussed the end of the book of Ezra and the first two chapters of Nehemiah. The first two chapters of Nehemiah talk about how he came about his journey and the beginning of the building of the wall. A quick perusal of chapter 3 talks about the building of the wall and who worked on it and the portion that they had people built. It starts with Eliashib, the high priest, building the sheep gate. And the list of builders includes, among others, the men of Jericho, the Tekoites, men of Gibeon, sons of goldsmiths, sons of apothecaries, rulers and their daughters, Levites, priests, men of the plain, and merchants. Many people repaired the wall. We see in this that the wall is built by a variety of people, and everyone had a part to play in it. If someone did not fulfill their duty, the wall would not stand. In 1 Corinthians 12, it talks about it in verse 12, "For as the body is one and hath many members, and all the members of that one body, being many, are one body." Every person had a role to play. They weren't just building a physical wall, they were also building a spiritual wall. We also know that there will arise challenges to attempt to build the wall. We see that in past examples throughout the history of the Bible, the wandering in the wilderness, the period of the Judges, when there were times when the Israelites were strong, put their trust in God. And there were times when they fell away and suffered. But then they realized their errors and cried to God and repented, and God brought them through their trials. This happened in the return from captivity with Ezra and in the building of the temple, and it also happened to Nehemiah. So when Nehemiah returns and begins the building of the wall, he has full support of his fellow Jews. Everyone is charged up to get the work done. He keeps them motivated by working on areas of the wall near their houses, which makes it easier for them to get to the site. He keeps the families together, which makes it easier to get food to the workers. And also working close to their home gives them more motivation to build the wall well, as it will be the wall that can protect them from outside enemies. Thus we see that the people are energized and worked hard side by side with each other to get the job done. This takes us to chapter 4, where we start to see how external influences affect those trying to do God's will. Now that the Jews were motivated and work was proceeding quickly on the wall and gates, those who were oppressing the Jews, including Sanballat, Tobiah, the Arabians, Ammonites, Ashdodites, they became wroth and conspired to come and fight against Jerusalem and hinder the building of the wall. They mocked the Jews, trying to discourage them, saying they were building walls with heaps of rubbish, and that the wall could easily be destroyed. It worked a bit because the Jews, after starting to build, became weaker. They grew tired, and because of their weariness, they began to let in evil into their minds and started to take heed to the opposition. Nehemiah prayed to God to turn their reproach on themselves because they provoked God to anger by trying to hinder the work that God wanted done. Nehemiah also encouraged the people and set up watches with weapons and reminded them that if God was on their side, that God was on their side, and if He is on your side, then who could be against you? It worked. The enemy became discouraged once they knew that Nehemiah and the Jews were ready for their attack. Nehemiah had half the people work while the other half guarded those working. Again, everyone had a role to play, whether it was to build, protect, or bear burdens. It was a 24-hour-a-day job. A reminder to us it requires total dedication of every moment to give the best of our ability to the service of God. Do all we do is unto the Lord. The external problem, as pointed out in chapter 4, was defeated for the time being, but there was another problem that was about to rear its head in chapter 5, an internal ecclesial problem. This problem was alluded to in chapter 3, verse 5, where we see the nobles of the Tekoites not putting out their necks to the work of the Lord. Now, looking at it from a worldly perspective, why would they? They were nobles. They were not of the reproachful class of most of the Jews. What gain was it for them to partake in a job that would harm their worldly status? We see how the external problem affected some of the people to help start the internal problem. There were others as well who were in a wealthy position, having great status and possessions. But those possessions and status were coming at the expense of their own country. The circumstances that they were all in brought to light the problems. Many of the Jews were poor, had to work hard to make a living. There was dearth or hunger and famine, which caused the people to mortgage their lands to buy corn and food. They also borrowed money to pay their taxes, and they even had to offer themselves or their sons or daughters into slavery to make payments. The working of the wall magnified the problem because it took away time from making money to pay off debts. So we see in the first verse of the chapter, they were crying at the injustice that their own brothers were doing to them. There are a few problems here that we can look at, that we can apply to our lives. We can allow ourselves to get caught up in the world trying to get ahead or keep up with others, working for more, trying to obtain more things. And once we get those things, we need to make more money to keep them, which means more work and less time for God. We need money to operate in this world, but how much? But when you look at what the Jews did in building the wall, what did it cost them? Nothing really, just time and effort. The supplies were ready. We don't need to have all the pleasures of the world to make life easy. If we look at Matthew 11:28-30, it says, "Come unto me, all ye that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you, and learn of me, for I am meek and lowly in heart, and ye shall find rest unto your souls. For my yoke is easy, and my burden is light." Another problem was that the nobles and the rich brothers were taking advantage of the poor ones. They were lending to the poor Jews and charging interest, which they were not supposed to do. In Exodus 22 and 25, it forbids the charging of interest to any of God's people, and they were in direct violation of God's law. Also, they were enslaving their own people. Exodus 21:2 required that if a Hebrew servant was bought, he would serve 6 years, and in the 7th go free. Here, they were not only enslaving their own people, they were selling them to the heathen. Sometimes they weren't even letting the slaves go free and kept them in bondage. When they were to be released, according to Deuteronomy 15:12-14, they were to release the servant and not let them go away empty, but provide the servant unto the flock and the floor and the winepress. Because God had blessed the master should give the servant, remembering that they were once slaves in Egypt, and God had redeemed them. So they were to treat these servants. And we can see another application in this is do unto others as you would have them do unto you, and treat your neighbor as yourself. Another problem that became evident in the ecclesia was that the governors were charging more tax than necessary, making their servants rulers over the people. So there was tax being collected for the ruler, and the servants collecting taxes for themselves. They were sometimes requiring 40 pieces of silver, more than what was required. No longer was the enemy that was outside the walls the main problem. It was still a big problem, but the new problem of fighting within became the main problem that threatened the completion of the wall. This problem today, as it was then, can be more dangerous and damaging than an external enemy. It can divide an ecclesia or nation, as we saw when Rehoboam became king. He did not give heed to the elder counselors of lowering taxes. But in this case, we see Nehemiah and his reaction as a leader. He was angry when he learned of the problems. He couldn't believe that God's people were not doing what God wanted and were following the ways of the world. The first thing he did was stop and think before he reacted. He consulted with himself. The word consulted means to take counsel. He most likely thought about God's words and commands. Chapter 1, verse 5 shows that he studied God's commandments and was knowledgeable in the truth. And And from this knowledge, he formed his response to put an end to the problem. He rebuked the nobles and rulers over the breaking of the law. But he didn't do this in private. He did it in front of the entire ecclesia. And this rebuke had the desired effect as they changed their ways and promised to return the land, vineyards, houses, money, and required nothing. And they all promised and took an oath to keep that promise. Then Nehemiah shook his lap, signifying that God would shake out any man from his home if he did not keep the promise. Again, the lesson that we can take from this is that God requires complete dedication of the heart and mind to follow his ways. Nehemiah sets the example of how to work in God's ways by staying committed, not taking part in worldly activities which only provide temporal satisfaction and gain, but providing for the poor and being sensitive to others' needs, and studying and learning God's word so we can be ready to apply to any situation that arises. His faith and commitment to God is shown in his actions. In James chapter 2, it says that faith is shown in works. His works of helping and guiding the people to build the wall, supporting the poor, redeeming them from slavery, rebuking the nobles, and setting them straight, were examples for the people of his time and for us. His faith was strong, and he continually sought God in prayer. He asked God to think about him for the good according to the works he had done for the people. Nehemiah was not occupied with his own self and his own personal gain. He was occupied with helping the people and keeping them on the path that would lead them to God. By building the wall, we can see it wasn't just a physical wall, but a spiritual wall as well. The wall was there to separate God's people from the world. He realized he couldn't be perfect in all that he did, and that he, like anyone, could sin. I think the point he's making here is that you have to try, keep trying 100% of the time. Keep your heart and mind focused on the building of the wall, which will help keep you separate from the world. Keep God in your center. And we need to study, learn, think, react, and pray like Nehemiah at all times.